Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to be back in community with you for our first Community Food Projects Community of Practice of the year. For those who I maybe haven't connected with yet, I'm Susan Lightfoot-Schempf, Executive Director of the Food Systems Leadership Network, and I'm here with my colleagues and partners, Emma Bliss from ISED Solutions and Adam Brock from Regenerate Change, who's going to be our guest speaker and presenter today. So thank you, Adam, for being here with us. And yeah, before we kind of get going, I'd love to hear who else is here. So if you want to go to the next slide, we just have a quick prompt. Introduce yourselves in the chat, please. Who are you? Who are you with? Where are you coming from? And just a little question to get us grounded in this season and in this conversation. What's nourishing you in this deep part of winter? And I'll just quickly model. I'm Susan, Food Systems Leadership Network. I'm in New Orleans, Louisiana, where it's actually been quite cold this week. And so I have been making some really fun soups from my CSA box, the latest of which was a fennel leek soup. And I will drop the recipe in the chat in a moment. It was absolutely delicious. So recipes encouraged, and however you want to interpret that prompt, please join in. I'm seeing lots of tea. Ooh, 13-month-old giggles, quilting projects. Nice. Thanks, y'all. Heated blanket. That's great. Thank you for sharing those and introducing yourselves in the chat. All right, let's go back to the next slide. Just as a reminder that this community of practice is hosted in partnership between the Food Systems Leadership Network and the Institute for Social and Economic Development Solutions, the mouthful, or ISED Solutions. Um, ISED is the recipient of the National Technical Assistance Grant for the USDA NIFA Community Food Projects program, and FSLN is a partner in that effort. And so ISED is providing support to applicants and grantees of the Community Food Projects program. And this is also open to everyone, anybody who identifies as working in community food systems and community food projects. So it's not just for the grantees and applicants of that program specifically. And FSLN is a collaborator. And one of the things that we're doing, in addition to kind of leading on this community of practice, is bringing the other opportunities that the Food Systems Leadership Network hosts to this broader network. So just wanted to highlight a couple of opportunities that are rolling out and happening for the FSLN right now. We are really excited to be hosting and kicking off the 9th cohort of our Community Food Systems Mentorship Program. The applications for this really amazing program will open on February the 5th. And we are hosting a kickoff call or like a program information call that same day. So I'm going to drop the registration link in the chat here momentarily. Would really encourage you if you are looking for some thought partnership and support from an elder or mentor in our movement. We have an absolutely stellar group of mentors that you can apply to work with. They are extraordinary human beings who have a lot of lived experience and expertise in community food systems, community food projects, and in building more equitable food systems. It's an extraordinary program, and we've supported hundreds of leaders across the years. And yeah, come and check it out. So I'll drop that in the chat in a minute. And then next week will be on Wednesday, our second harvest hour. And the harvest hours for the network are quarterly meetups to really like not have programs and services and all those kinds of, kind of more formal efforts that the FSLN is doing, but rather a more informal space for us just to connect, to build relationship, to talk story, and build relationships with one another. So I'll also drop the winter harvest hour opportunity in the chat as well. I wanted to open it up real quick and see if anybody else has announcements that they want to share, whether it's resources, opportunities, things that you want to put on other people's radars. You can drop them in the chat or you can unmute and chime in. I think one that I wanted to make sure that folks were aware of is that the Cliff Foundation has their open RFP right now. It closes March the 1st. This is one of the rare funding opportunities that is an open call from organizations. So if you fit within their guidelines, of which I think most organizations within this community of practice would fit, take a look at that opportunity and consider putting in an application. Emma, any announcements on the ISED side? Nope. Anybody have any events that they're hosting or, stories, things in the news you want to drop in and share with your colleagues? Please just drop them in the chat. Can always do that as we go in this conversation. And okay, let's go to the next slide. Oh, nice. Thanks, Kavita. Another opportunity, RAFI, Rural Advancement Foundation International, I think is what RAFI stands for.
That's the
Grants are
one.
open. That's it. All right. Kavita, you want to speak to this? What are those grants for?
Yeah, absolutely. Apologies, my internet is a little finicky today, so I'm going to be off camera. But hi, everyone. Um, so Refi has grants that are for farmers in the Southeast and the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico every year. So this is just our annual granting cycle that is specifically for farms that'll be opening up in the next couple weeks. And if you want to share within your particular networks, if you have questions, let me know. I can pass you on to our relevant staff. But it's a really good opportunity for farmers to get ahead when there's unclear funding in other parts of the world. So we're excited to see what comes in.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I imagine you're going to get a lot of applications. So thanks for sharing that, a little sneak peek. Um, And oh, Cassandra, I hope I pronounced your name right, wrote an article last month about local farmers and why they need funding. Amazing. In The Guardian. Awesome. Well done. Definitely want to take a look at that. So thanks, y'all. Keep dropping opportunities and resources and other, pieces of news and such. We're coming to the well to share information with each other. That's what happens in these spaces. So thanks for bringing that forward. And before I tee up Adam, I just want to reground us as always in the Food Systems Leadership Network's cultural agreements. So these agreements were co-created network members back in 2022, and they have held us through some extraordinary times in this field and still feel really true. So just want to invite everyone to be culture co-creators in this space today. We will be doing some breakout conversations. So just a reminder to bring these agreements into those conversations. So honoring and celebrating our collective wisdom. Together, we know a lot. Being mindful of our power, privilege, and how much space we're taking up. Taking responsibility for impact, regardless of intent. Meeting each other where we are, showing up is enough, and listening is participating. Giving grace to one another and approach conflict with curiosity. Silence is not consent. Proactively seek permission from others. Honor confidentiality, lessons leave, stories stay. We take care of our own physical, mental, and emotional needs, and we challenge assumptions, speak from our differences, respect our differences, and speak from our own experience. My goodness, if we could bring these cultural agreements out into all of our relationships, all our relations, all of our communities, what a better world we'd be living in. So, invite you to carry these out into your day past this community of practice too. Just a couple last Zoom housekeeping. I think you can take the slides down now. Thank you, Emma. Thank you for everybody who's got your cameras on. It's so nice to see your faces. Reminder to please stay on mute if you are not talking, just because it can get a little wild in these Zoom spaces. Um, During breakouts today, if any point you are not feeling safe or are just not in a space for engaging, just hang back here in the main room. That's always okay to do. And we're not allowing AI bots in this space right now, so the fireflies and such, but we are recording and we'll share the recording with y'all after the fact. Um, and yeah, I think that's it. Any questions? Y'all ready to get into it? Glad to have you here. Um, so I'm going to tee up Adam. Adam, thank you so much for being here. I have had the great pleasure of working with Adam Brock over this last year and his organization, Regenerate Change, who's really been partnering with the Food Systems Leadership Network in our evolution and transformation. As a previous program within an institution, we have spun out and become independent, and the Regenerate Change team has been really crucial in supporting us with capacity and facilitation and thought partnership in that process. And one of the ways in which we worked with Adam and the Regenerate Change team was in forming a leadership council for the network. So we did not have a formal board of any kind, and we needed to create some form of accountability and leadership and counsel for this emerging and growing network. And so worked very closely with Adam to create the container for that and to invite folks into it and start building capacity within that council. So when Emma and I had chatted about some of the kind of issues that were bubbling up in this community of practice of where people were looking for support and the notion of, how do we build better leadership councils and boards to support our work? I thought of Adam and the work that Regenerate Change has done, and it ends up that they've done quite a lot of work around supporting board development in community food organizations. So um, Adam's going to be bringing really like tools and stories and experiences from a really wide range of organizations, both from the own organizations that he has founded and led, but also with the organizations that he's been working with across the ecosystem. So, with that, Adam, I'm going to pass the mic over to you. And again, thank you for being here to share your perspective and resources and tools with us.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And thanks to all of you, both for showing up today on this community of practice. I really look forward to hearing your ideas and thoughts and questions. And even more importantly, just for the incredible work that y'all are doing across the country. I just want to acknowledge that this is a tender moment for many of us in the work we do in the communities we serve in the big story of our country. And I can imagine that each of you are probably showing up with a lot on your hearts and spirits, not to mention your to-do lists. So the fact that y'all are here to think big picture and creatively about governance and boards and leadership and to connect with one another really speaks to your commitment to this work. And I just want to honor and acknowledge that. I also want to name just a little bit more about my background because I feel like this is a group that I could have really used, I don't know, 13, 14 years ago when I was running a small startup food justice nonprofit in Denver, Colorado. And we were the recipient of a FMPP grant. So not the exact same thing, but another, USDA program, grassroots urban agriculture, food access work. Um, and yeah, that was kind of intimidating and overwhelming at the time. And as the co-director of that nonprofit, I was working really closely with my board and trying to figure out the best way for them to be an asset to us rather than something that just felt like an extra thing to manage. And we got there, we figured it out. But I know from that direct experience and certainly from my work as a food systems consultant and facilitator for the last decade or so and working with so many amazing organizations that boards can sometimes be a challenge. So with that, I'm gonna kick us off with just a breakout so you all can start grounding each other in where y'all are at around boards. So our question for you before you get sent off into your breakouts, we have two questions. One is, how would you describe the health of your board? And what's something you want to improve about your board? So just in general, where is your board at? And if there's anything in particular that you have in mind about the board's kind of edge of growth, you can share that with your partner. And we will sharing a little bit. Actually, first I want to start, before I even get to the slides, I just want to start by acknowledging something, which is that boards are weird. Um, you know, the reason we have boards as nonprofits is because we're required to. You can't be a nonprofit without a board. I'm sure some nonprofits would have them anyways, but regardless of if we want to or not, every nonprofit has to have a board. And the board members are in some ways like the ultimate have the ultimate kind of authority, fiduciary duty for the organization. And yet at the same time, they're usually very distant from the work that you're actually doing. They can't be paid, and you're asking them to make this big commitment on behalf of the organization. The default structure of how boards generally work in nonprofits is not very conducive or accessible to non-professionals. And so there's just like all kinds of different structural things about boards and the way they work that might often feel like they are not aligned with the kind of change we want to make in the world. How do we align these structures with our values as an organization, right? Maybe this resonates with you, maybe not. But I know that I've worked with a lot of nonprofits that really struggle with how to make their boards work for them and how to take this requirement and actually turn it into a true deep asset. So knowing that, I would love to just start sharing a little bit about kind of some of the basics of what boards are required to do, or at least what most boards and nonprofits do. I'm going to take a lens that we always come back to at Regenerate Change. Our background is all as ecological designers. So I'm going to look at how does nature do governance, which, we'll see what we mean by that in a minute. And then I'm going to share a bunch of kind of interesting, unique, new-ish models for board governance that hopefully at least one of them might be applicable to your board. So that's what we have in store. And by the way, I'm seeing these great comments coming through in the chat. Yeah, really appreciate all the different things that are coming up of how to be mindful, how to set good expectations, how to recruit the right folks, and hopefully we'll touch on all of those over the next 20-30 minutes or so. Okay, so when it comes to what a board actually does, of course, every board is different. The culture of the board, who's on the board, how you build them into your structure as an organization. But at least based on the organizations I've worked with over the years, most boards come down to three core things. The first one is strategy, kind of collaborating on setting the mission and vision of the organization, and also collaborating on creating the annual budget, which of course itself is a form of a strategy document. Then there's stewardship. Hiring and overseeing the executive director is typically the board's role. Stewarding the organization's assets, whether those are financial assets, physical assets, intellectual property, those kinds of things, supporting with fundraising, and serving as ambassadors to kind of be stewards of your organization's visibility and goodwill in their networks and the community at large. And then the third core function is growth and renewal, recruiting and orienting more board members and participating in board development themselves. Often these last two things seem to fall to the executive director, but In my experience, the best functioning boards are ones that see this as part of their duty as well. And to the extent that you can work with your boards to help them, uh, feel proactive around doing that work as part of their duties, definitely takes a lot off your plate. I'm not going to go over everything on this slide about the distinction between working and oversight boards, but I'll just name that, like anything else in nonprofits, boards evolve as your organization does. And so very often at the beginning of an organization, at the beginning of its life cycle, you might have what's called a working board, and that's where the board is kind of really has their sleeves rolled up and is involved in a lot of the day-to-day aspects of making the organization happen. And that, of course, is invaluable. It's very, very important. When you have very little capacity, you might not have enough money to pay staff to have board members, doing things like writing grant applications or showing up to lead some of your programs. And as your as your organization matures and you have more folks on staff and you solidify your programming and things become a little bit more stable, ideally the role of the board shifts to that right-hand column where they're looking at things from kind of a big picture, long-term view. They're not getting in the weeds because ultimately that's the staff's role. And as folks who are volunteers, probably only checking in on the organization once, twice a month, they just don't know as much about what's happening on the ground. So for them to be kind of talking about how this specific program should be run or recommending, detailed ways of doing things, starts to actually become more of a hindrance than an opportunity. And so, the culture of the board shifts to being really big picture. So I'm guessing most of this is something that you all are very familiar with, but I know that lots of organizations struggle with this transition. And if board members are used to being working board members, sometimes it can be hard for them to shift to being oversight board members. And so it's, helpful language if this is something that you haven't encountered before. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about living systems and how living systems handle, what we in organizations call governance, but really is just about how materials and resources flow through a system. How do living systems decide that? And you can see on this slide 4 different examples of one way that living systems can distribute materials or resources. What do all 4 of these things have in common? A tree, a watershed, our circulatory system, and our lungs. All of them are branching structures. In ecology, these are sometimes called dendritic structures, and in society, these are called hierarchies, right? So we see these kind of hierarchical structures in many places in living systems. And if you look at what they each have in common, they are all very efficient. This kind of branching structure where there's a trunk that collects all of the resources and then the different branches that send them to different places, that is the most materials efficient way of collecting or distributing things. Generally, in these examples, the flow is only going in one direction. It's either going from the so-called leaves or twigs to the trunk or vice versa. It depends on what the material is. And also, these structures are vulnerable to disruption, right? So if you cut off one of those core branches of the tree, everything that comes after that branch is not going to get access to the nutrients from the soil. It's not going to get access to the water, and basically it's all going to die. And the same is true of all these other examples, right? So we can see from living systems both what is good about hierarchies and also some of the blind spots. Then there are network structures. There are web structures, and we see that in spider webs. We see that in the kind of underground mycelia. We see that in our own brains. Our neurons are form a web, and we see that even in food webs, right? This is a different way of allocating where resources and informations flow. What we see when we compare all of these ones is that they are innovative, they're adaptable, they're flexible, much more so than the hierarchical structures. That's why our brains are networked rather than, dendritic, because our brains need to be flexible and adaptable and innovative all the time. They are resilient, unlike a branching structure. If you cut off one of those branches, if you break one of those connections, the whole is still intact, right? Because there's multiple different connections. Um, Things can flow in multiple directions. Resources can flow in all kinds of different ways. And what all of that means is that these webbed, kind of more democratic models, you could say, are energy intensive. It takes a lot more work in nature to maintain all of those connections, right? Our brains are only 2% of our body weight, but it takes 10% of our blood oxygen in order to keep our brains going. So they kind of punch above their weight in terms of the amount of energy that it needs to sustain them. And I'm sure those of you who have participated in more democratic or consensus decision making can relate to this, right? Basically the more networked or democratic a governance process is, the more expensive it is in terms of time. And so what this all comes down to is when you're thinking about governance for your board, and for your organization as a whole, what living systems tell us is that there is this trade-off between efficiency on one hand and participation on the other hand. This trade-off between the most quickest, easiest way of doing things and the most democratic way of doing things. And it's not about one being better than the other, but it's about figuring out what is the right situation or what is the right structure for your specific situation and how to combine these structures. Kate, I see your comment that stuff goes both ways. Yes, it is very much true that photosynthesis comes from the leaves to the trunk, and then nutrients come from the trunk or roots to the leaves. But there's only one dendritic system for each of those. So there's like the xylem that does one and the phloem that does the other. In our circulatory systems, we have our veins and capillaries, and one of them sends blood out into the body, and then there's a whole parallel system that takes it back in. So they can work in both directions, but it's usually in situations where there's that bidirectional flow, you actually need two separate systems layered on top of each other. Okay, so with that kind of overall oversight or insight about this kind of balance between resilience, innovation on one hand, and efficiency on the other, I'm going to talk through a few different examples of what some nonprofits are doing in terms of how they're integrating these different paradigms in different ways. So the first one is a worker self-directed nonprofit. I'm guessing some of you might have heard of this model. It's relatively new, I'd say, in the last 10 years or so. A lot of this model has been pioneered by the Southern Economies Law Center. And this is taking a lot of the principles and thinking of co-ops and applying it to a nonprofit, a 501c3 structure. So in this worker self-directed model, there still is a board because, again, nonprofits are legally required to have a board. And that board fulfills a lot of the basic fiduciary duties. So making sure that everything is okay legally, that the board is being a good steward of its resources, it approves the budget. But then the staff is actually taking care of a lot of the strategic things that typically in a more traditional model a board would do. And that staff, by the way, is typically collaboratively led. So the staff itself is generally less hierarchical. There might be an ED, but if there is, they're taking on a lot less power than they have in a more traditional nonprofit. And the staff collaboratively develops the budget. They set the strategy and programming. They determine who needs to be on the staff and how that's structured. Another model is having beneficiaries on boards. And I'm actually curious if this is something that any of you all have experimented with. I'd love to hear in the chat the extent. And when I say beneficiaries, that's just, I'm using that word to mean the folks you serve, community members, farmers, if you're an organization that serves farmers, or folks who live in the geographic area that you work with. I know this is something that many organizations aspire to, and many organizations do it. I think this is a great way to have feedback and accountability from the folks you're trying to serve. This is a great way of embodying the ethos of nothing about us without us, right? Like ideally, we want big decisions about our work to be determined at least in solidarity, if not fully determined by the folks that we're serving, right? Because they're the experts and they're the ones who should determine how resources flow to them. And what I've also seen is that many boards struggle to make this work in practice without tokenizing community members. Because in many cases, as we named earlier, the structure of a board and the typical ways we're used to thinking of boards, like, you meet for 2 hours once a month on Zoom, and you make decisions through, offering a motion that other people second, right? There's like all these different cultural practices that may or may not be familiar to folks who don't have the kind of professional background that a more traditional board might have. And so it's very easy for those folks to, if it's not all community members, for them to feel tokenized, or that they feel like they have to learn all of these practices that aren't clear to them. And so, the organizations that are doing this well, and I'm seeing some great examples in the chat, and I'm guessing you all are doing this well, you really have to commit to designing the culture and structure of your boards around the needs of those folks who are community members or beneficiaries, right? Everything from the time that the meeting is happening, to the way you set agendas, to the way you talk about things, not kind of moving past lingo really quickly, but taking time to explain things, depending on the different cultures and backgrounds that folks hold, their class backgrounds, their ethnic backgrounds, right? Like ideally you want your board culture to be reflective of that and not something that everyone else has to integrate into. And so I think this can be a really powerful model, and it sounds like there's at least a few folks on this call who have done it really well. And it's also a model that is a big commitment to actually implement. Sociocracy might be another model that some folks here are familiar with. This is the idea where instead of having a board that has all the decisions made by the whole board, or as is often the case, a board might have a few different committees, and some of those committees do some of the day-to-day work and then bring it up to the board for recommendation. Instead, you have a series of circles. So there's the board itself that has, say, 10 or 15 members, and then there's circles, and each circle has at least a couple board members, but it might also have folks who are not on the board. And those circles are comprised of people who have the most stake in whatever it is that circle is about. So say you might have a finance circle that sets the budget, and you would have if you have someone in your organization that is the lead financial person, they would be on there as well as some board members. And then you might have a programming circle in which there might be board members as well as folks who are participants in the programs. And unlike typical board committees, yeah, you and I are on the same page, Olivia. Unlike committees, they actually have a lot more decision-making authority than a typical board committee has. So this is a comparison of the two. So, and again, every board is different. So these things on the left might not apply to your board, and maybe you're doing more of the things on the right already without calling it sociocracy. But a more traditional board committee, the committee itself doesn't make a lot of big decisions. They recommend things to the board. Typical board committees are often mostly board members. And then the way decisions are made in those committees or the board itself is through majority. Whereas in sociocracy, it uses a consent-based decision-making model, which is the shortest way of putting that is, instead of saying, are you yes or no on this? It's saying, can everyone in this group agree that this is safe enough to try? And it allows you to say that I don't love this decision, but it does feel safe enough to try. So it allows for a little bit more of a spectrum of decisions and incorporation of those dissenting or minority opinions. Then there's elections. So for organizations that have a clearly defined membership or are clearly creating kind of a bound community, or maybe you are working in a very specific geographic area in which you're doing a lot of organizing work and the folks who you're working with are very deeply involved in the day-to-day. This could be a good model where your beneficiaries, they may or may not be serving on the board, but at the very least, they are electing folks themselves who end up on the boards. So, there's ways that members can nominate who should be on the board. And then there's, usually annually, although it could be at different timelines, they look through those nominations and elect. And so, of course, this is much more common in 501c6s, membership organizations, or cooperatives, but it is also a model that you can apply to your 501c3. And then the last model that I want to share is auxiliary boards. I know sometimes we find in our boards that there's some people who are really great at doing the big strategy and fiduciary duty stuff on the board, and we want them on the board. But then we also, need people who have connections to funders, and we want them on the board, but they're too busy to show up to the board meeting. And then we also want community members on the board because that feels like the right thing to do, right? And this is a way of separating those into distinct different bodies. So in this case, there might be a governance board, and the governance board focuses just on that kind of fiduciary duty, on setting the strategy, and ideally on communicating and listening to these other bodies. But then you have a whole separate group that doesn't have that fiduciary decision-making body that's an advisory board, for example. And that advisory board might be a group of esteemed subject matter experts. It could be a group of community members, as in a community advisory board. But either way, that board comes together to work through difficult questions facing the organization, advise the staff and governance board, and then it goes from there. And then another, you could have a third group that's a patron board, which again, they don't have any decision-making power, but they've been assembled specifically to help you fundraise. And so maybe that's a group that doesn't meet as frequently, or that when you meet, you talk about different things and you can just focus on, putting on events or individual donors. And then those people don't need to be the same people that are on your governance board. Okay. So that's a lot that I've thrown out you. We're gonna get into breakout groups in a moment to kind of process and metabolize that in groups. But before we do that, I wanted to pause and hear if y'all have any specific reflections, feedback. I'm going to take this time to look back at what y'all have been putting in the chat, and I might respond to some of that as well. But feel free to add more things to the chat, or just take yourself off mute if you have things you want to share or ask, or give an example of how you're doing one of these things and how it's worked or maybe not worked. While we're waiting, I just want to acknowledge, I was reading Liz's comment about having a seat on the board for a farmer or producer, but the challenges of having them engage, do the demands of their occupation. That's a great example of what I was sharing, right? It's like, we want the farmers to be focusing on being out there growing the food. And while, yeah, you could make a good argument like, yeah, the farmers should be the ones having the say in our organization, when it comes down to the practicalities of their day-to-day lives, sometimes asking them to be a board member is just like one other commitment that is a burden for them. And so, really in situations like that, sometimes what I find best is what I call translators, cultural translators. So maybe someone who was a farmer for 15 years and is still really connected with that community, but now they've moved on to a different career and they have the space to be a board member. Maybe they're a retired farmer or something like that. But rather than asking the people who are actively farming themselves, because sometimes that causes more challenges than it solves. Stephanie's wondering, is there anyone out there using the worker self-directed model? Anyone in this group who's experimented with that or is aware of nonprofits doing that? I'm certainly aware of a couple, but I'd love to hear from you all.
I can chime in real quick if that's okay. So we don't use that model. We use the beneficiaries model, and I think it's great because we are very representative of the community. We're all local or part-time residents. We have a farmer on our board, and we represent the values of our organization in the community. Where we struggle is that none of us have professional board experience, and so we aren't great at asking people for money, and we have a hard time with recruitment. All the things that a professional board would be great at, we struggle with. And so that's where we're really working, hoping to improve. And we're all pretty much brand new. We've only been on the board for a year and a half to a year, maybe less. So we're all very green as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Olivia. And yeah, I mean, it's true. That can be the flip side of having a real deep commitment to beneficiaries on the board. And also, honestly, I think sometimes boards that are mostly or fully beneficiaries have a little bit of imposter syndrome around like, oh, we don't know what it means to be a quote unquote real board, but that they're actually more innovative and often as deeply or more deeply engaged in the board work. So, I would invite you to think about like rather than having your group of beneficiaries try and act like a more traditional board would, like what are the things that this group can do that a more traditional board would never be able to do? And then, of course, you also do need folks who can help you fundraise and things like that. But perhaps that's an opportunity to have one of these auxiliary boards or something like that and get a different group of people who are really good at that. Okay. Yeah, Susan asks, do you all think there's a need out there for board training and capacity building? Yeah, great question. I know certainly for organizations I've worked with, whether or not it's what they come to me for, it often ends up being a part of what our organization does, is supporting boards and understanding more clearly what their role is, how they can do it better, how they can, even if you're more seasoned professional, it can be really hard to ask for money, right? So just helping people practice their pitches, all those kinds of things. Anybody else want to share reflections, questions, things that came up for you from these conversations? I also just want to name that fascinating conversation in the chat from the breakout, who none of the folks did have boards, just because of the way y'all's organizations are organized, and how governance does and does not show up in those different things. That was fascinating to read. Okay, well, maybe this is a good time to send us to our second breakout, which is just gonna similarly send you into groups again, and have you kind of discuss these things in a little bit of a more intimate context where you can, talk about the things that are more specific to y'all's actual situations. So we have another 2 questions for you. What are you harvesting from everything we've talked about today? And what is one concrete step you want to take for your own board? I think the models are models, right? They're maps. They're not the actual they're not cookie cutters. I think sometimes you'll see folks who are like big sociocracy people, and they're like, sociocracy is the way all boards need to be, or every nonprofit should be a worker self-directed nonprofit, right? And I've seen each of these work, and I've also seen each of them not work. And it's so much about the context, the culture, who's the leader, the executive director who's already on the board, and it's much more about, these are frameworks to spark your ideas, and hopefully to inspire you towards things that you might not have thought of, but none of them should be considered as things that you should try and take and do exactly like I shared it, or like a website that talks about it in more detail talks about it. So yeah, thanks for naming that conditionality of all of this, Kate.
I'm curious, just to get a sense, is there anybody here who feels like they've had a really healthy experience, either being on a board or working with a board, and what you think the special sauce was or is? Like what enabled those conditions to be as healthy as they are? Right, Kate, listening.
Mhm.
I
Caitlin, yes,
yeah,
please.
I was on a board for a 501(c)(3, so a member board a number of years ago, and I was on it for a couple of years and saw a secretary take over like a president role, and she was very organized and communicative and outlined roles and responsibilities, and I really saw how her leadership skills really transformed the board in those couple of years. And now, of course, it's hard to pass that baton, and when new leadership took over, it wasn't the same. But those couple of years, I just really felt like it was moving well because of her organization, leadership, seeing the big picture, outlining clear roles and responsibilities. And I learned a lot from her.
Nice.
Nice. Thanks, Caitlin. Having that like backbone person is really key. Yeah, and just Jan, I'm seeing your point here, like somebody that's whose responsibility it is their job to work with, manage, support, facilitate the work of the board. Whether that is somebody on the board itself or in Caitlin's example, or it's somebody on staff that's doing that. It's really important.
Yeah, I think Justin's counterexample in the chat is really instructive and kind of speaking to some of the things we were talking about earlier about how we might want to have beneficiaries on our board. And that feels like philosophically like the right thing to do. And then there might be lots of reasons why that really doesn't practically make sense. And rather than, keep trying to make that happen and make that happen, sometimes it's better to listen to what wants to happen. In your case, it sounds like, you just dissolved the board altogether, and that was something you were able to do. But you have other ways, it looks like, of hearing from those beneficiaries, and sometimes those can be just as effective, if not more so. How folks do find board members, because I know with many boards I work with, that is one of the more challenging parts. You might have a really well functioning board and you've got it all dialed in, and before you know it, like 3 of those board members are turning off and you have to kind of start all over again, right? So yeah, I'd be curious to hear what if that's a struggle that other folks on this call can resonate with, and if folks have any tips for each other about how to find those good board members and how to get them motivated to participate. I do see that situation come up a lot where like any given community, has a finite number of, movers and shakers, and they're often already they've been asked by other organizations to be on their boards, and they don't want to overcommit and be on everybody's board, understandably. So yeah, and this gets back to that model that I think Olivia was talking about, where you might have a board comprised of folks that aren't as experienced, and in that case, boards can actually be a really powerful vehicle for leadership development. To give people the confidence to become those movers and shakers. That may or may not be aligned with what you actually need as a nonprofit in that moment. But it is, one way of looking at it is, can we find folks who are excited to serve on the board, who might not have that typical board profile, and work collaboratively with them to build those skills, build that network, whatever it is, for them to grow into the role of an incredible board member.
Thank y'all so much for a really great conversation. I know that I'm taking away a lot to think about and incorporate into the work that we're doing with our leadership council, and hopefully everyone's walking away with a little nugget or something to think about, incorporate into your work. So I think that we might be kind of wrapping up on our convo here. Are there any more questions or curiosities that you want to, tap into the collective wisdom of this room before we close out based on this conversation? So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Adam, for so generously offering your perspective. I really loved the comparing to natural systems and thinking about governance in the natural ecosystems. That was a lot of food for thought. So, and thanks everybody for prioritizing time. Thanks, Emma, for your tech support here today. And please join us next week for the Harvest Hour of the FSLN, and for that mentorship program kickoff call. If you're feeling the call and the urge to get that kind of support this year, come and learn more about the program. So we'll see you all soon. We'll be back next month, and lots of other ways to plug in the meantime.